When your only son forgets your 70th birthday, it doesn't just hurt. It reopens every quiet wound you thought time had healed. Before we continue, be part of our growing family by hitting that subscribe button. And here's something fun. Share your name and tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments. We might feature you with a shout out in our next video, because your support truly means the world to us. Now, let's proceed. They used to call me a man who never complained. The kind of man who took what life handed him, wiped his hands clean, and went back to work without a word. I wore that reputation like a medal, though in truth, it was more like armor. You can hide a lot of small heartbreaks behind quiet manners. You can lose people one gentle silence at a time. On my 70th birthday, I woke up before sunrise, like I always did, though I had nowhere to be. I shaved carefully, put on the blue shirt my late wife always said made me look trustworthy, and set the table for three, one for myself, one for my son Daniel, and one for his daughter, my Lily. The good plates, the heavy ones that never saw daylight unless it was someone's birthday. The roast sat in the oven, slow-cooked since dawn. I even ironed the old white tablecloth, the one with the faint wine stain from my wife's 53rd. I told myself the effort mattered more than the turnout. By 5 o'clock, the house smelled like comfort, rosemary, meat, and all the things you can't smell without remembering love. By 6, I had checked the clock 3 times. By 7, I'd memorized every tick. I sent Daniel a simple text, "Dinner's ready when you are." No reply. I convinced myself he'd lost track of time. Busy man, big job, single father, traffic maybe. By 8, I'd stopped lying to myself. You'd think at 70, a man would be used to disappointment. I wasn't. There's a difference between losing things to time and being forgotten by choice. One feels natural. The other feels like punishment. When the clock struck 9, I lit the candle anyway. One candle, a habit my wife started. For wishes, she'd say. Not for years. I looked at that small, flickering light and whispered, "You did good, old man. You did good." I blew it out before the wax had time to drip. The silence after that was thick. It's strange how silence can have weight. It filled the room like smoke, pressed against my chest. I sat for a long time at that table, watching the candles smoke coil and vanish, and for the first time in years, I wondered if maybe people were right. Maybe I really did like being alone. Maybe I'd built my life that way, piece by piece, excuse by excuse, until it became a fortress too strong for my own family to enter. But that's the trick of pain. It makes philosophers out of fools. The truth was simpler. I wasn't proud, or private, or peaceful. I was just forgotten. I cleaned the dishes, wrapped the roast, poured the wine back into the bottle. Then I sat again, this time without the pretense of celebration. I thought of Daniel as a boy, how he used to race down the hallway shouting, "Dad, look what I built." Every time he said Dad, it sounded like a discovery. Somewhere along the years, that word lost its urgency. It became formal, scheduled, something he said between calendar appointments. I don't blame him for that entirely. Life gets noisy, and when people can't hear love, they start assuming it's still there, somewhere under the static. But love, left unattended, fades into a kind of polite silence. That's what we had, polite silence. When I finally went to bed, it was past midnight. I stared at the ceiling fan tracing shadows across the room and felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of clarity that only comes when disappointment hardens into decision. The next morning, the phone rang. "Dad," Daniel's voice. Polished, hurried. The same tone he used with clients. "Hey, I'm so sorry about last night. There was an emergency at work, and I didn't interrupt, didn't ask, didn't even sigh. I let him say the words that let him sleep better. When he finished, I said, 'I understand.' And I think that's when I lost him again, not because of what he did, but because of what I didn't say." He exhaled, relieved. "You're the best, Dad. We'll do something soon, okay?" "Sure," I said. After we hung up, I sat there with the phone still in my hand, feeling older than I'd ever felt. The roast was cold, the house quiet, and something in me, something soft, began to calcify. Then my phone buzzed again. A message. From Lily. Grandpa, is it true that you wanted to be alone yesterday? Just one line. No emojis. No follow-up. At first, I thought I'd misread it. I blinked, read it again, and the room seemed to tilt slightly. It wasn't just that Daniel hadn't come. It was that he'd rewritten the story. He'd told his daughter, my granddaughter, that I didn't want them there. That was the moment the air left the room. The moment disappointment turned into something sharper. I stared at the text for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen, my reflection faint on the black glass. The man who never complained was looking back at me, asking what silence had ever earned him except loneliness. For the first time in 70 years, I didn't want to be the man who let things slide. I didn't want to be understanding. I wanted to be remembered, properly. And I decided I would be. Grief doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just lingers in the air, faint as dust, until something ordinary disturbs it. That morning, it was sunlight on my kitchen floor, bright, careless, as if nothing had happened. I sat at the table with my coffee cooling beside me, staring at that text from Lily. 10 words. That's all it took to unravel 70 years of silence I'd mistaken for peace. I wanted to believe Daniel had made a mistake, that he hadn't meant to twist the truth. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. When you've outlived your patience, every injustice shines like glass under sunlight. I tried to eat breakfast, but every bite turned bitter halfway down. My mind kept returning to that single line of text. Grandpa, is it true you wanted to be alone yesterday? I imagined Lily's little hands holding the phone, her eyes flicking across the screen, believing her father's version of me. In her world now, I was the old man who didn't want company, who pushed love away. Daniel hadn't just skipped my birthday. He'd rewritten my character in my granddaughter's eyes. That, more than anything, was what hurt. For hours I sat there, the house humming quietly around me. Refrigerator, clock, birds outside. The whole indifferent orchestra of an ordinary day. But inside me, something shifted. The years of endurance that people mistook for virtue began to feel like cowardice. I realized that I'd let Daniel grow into a man who thought truth was negotiable, and that my quiet approval had been his permission slip. I stood up, poured the cold coffee down the sink, and looked at my reflection in the window above it. The man staring back wasn't soft or forgiving. His eyes were steady, calculating. I didn't recognize him, but I understood him. For the first time in decades, I said aloud, "No, I didn't want to be alone." My voice cracked halfway through, thin and foreign. But the sound of it, the defiance, it lit something inside me. I went to the drawer in the hall and pulled out an old photo album. Daniel's childhood. Baseball uniforms, birthday candles, camping trips. Evidence of love. Tangible proof that I had once been someone worth remembering. I flipped through it, page after page, and found myself trembling, not from nostalgia, but from something colder. Because I realized something cruel and simple. I had never once let Daniel feel the consequences of his neglect. Every missed visit, every broken promise, I had always excused, soothed, covered up. He's busy, I'd say. He'll come around. I'd spent decades protecting him from guilt, and in doing so, I taught him that my pain didn't matter. It was a strange kind of revelation, that kindness, left unchecked, can become its own cruelty. By afternoon, the house felt smaller, the air heavier. I couldn't stay inside the silence any longer. So I put on my coat and walked to the diner at the edge of town, the one Joe and I used to haunt when the world still felt like it needed our advice. Joe wasn't there yet, but I ordered his usual, black coffee, 2 sugars, out of habit. I sat by the window and watched the cars slide by. Families, couples, people in a hurry to be somewhere that mattered. The waitress gave me a kind smile, the kind reserved for old men who look like they've lost something they can't name. When Joe finally walked in, he looked exactly as he always did. Tall, a little crooked at the shoulders, faced like a crumpled road map, every line leading somewhere true. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, sliding into the booth. The ghost of birthdays passed. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "He didn't come, Joe. He didn't ask who. He just nodded slowly, like he'd expected the sentence all along. He said there was an emergency at work, I added. But then Lily, she texted me, asked if I wanted to be alone. That got him quiet. He stirred his coffee for a while before saying, "So he lied." "Yeah." Joe sighed. "That kind of lie ain't about you, you know. It's about him. He's ashamed." "I know. But shame's a luxury he's always had. He gets to feel bad, say sorry, and move on. I get to live with the echo." Joe leaned back, studying me. "You thinking of saying something?" I met his eyes. "No. I'm thinking of doing something." That made him smile, slow and sad. "Took you 70 years to get dangerous, huh?" I didn't smile back. "Not dangerous. Just done pretending." The waitress refilled our cups and left us in the soft murmur of the diner. Joe sipped his coffee, waiting for me to continue. "I want him to understand," I said finally. "Not just apologize. Understand. I want him to look at me and realize what he's turned me into. The man his daughter now thinks prefers silence to love." Joe nodded, but his eyes carried warning. "Be careful, pal. When you start planning how to hurt someone you love, you're building a trap for yourself too." I looked out the window again, watching the reflections blur. "Maybe, but sometimes you have to build the trap so they can see it before they fall in." He didn't argue, just reached across the table and tapped my hand once, the way old friends do when words start meaning less than touch. That evening, I walked home through the fading light. The town was alive, children shouting, someone's radio playing a love song from a decade I remembered too well. But inside me, something quiet had solidified. The man who never complained had finally found something worth breaking his silence for. And I knew exactly who I needed to call tomorrow. Sleep didn't visit that night. I lay in the dark listening to the creak of the house, counting the gaps between the sounds. Every pause felt like time holding its breath, waiting for me to do something about the ache I'd let fester for decades. When dawn finally bled through the curtains, I rose, dressed, and drove back to the diner. The roads were empty. The world hadn't woken yet, which suited me fine. Vengeance, I learned that morning, prefers quiet company. Joe was already there, leaning over the counter, reading a newspaper from yesterday. He looked up when I walked in, saw the determination on my face, and folded the paper without a word. "Coffee?" he asked. "Black," I said, "and something stronger than sympathy." He chuckled, the low, gravelly kind that sounded like the start of wisdom. "You planning to write him out of the will?" "Maybe," I said, taking the seat beside him. "But money's just paper. I want something that stays." He turned toward me fully then. "You want him to feel what you felt?" "Yes." For a long while, we sat in silence, both knowing that naming pain doesn't heal it. It sharpens it. Finally, Joe said, "You remember what I told you when Marie passed?" I nodded. "You said grief's just love that forgot where to go." "Right," he said. "Well, anger's the same. You gotta aim it somewhere that does more than burn." I looked at him, half amused, half desperate. "You going to tell me how to do that?" He smiled slow. "You ever heard my old rule?" I shook my head. He leaned forward, elbows on the counter. "When you love someone, don't teach them a lesson. Teach them how to come home." I let the words sit between us. They sounded noble, but I wasn't sure they applied to me anymore. And what if they already packed up their conscience and moved out? Then, Joe said, "You remind them there's still a door. You just make that door impossible to ignore." He stirred his coffee, eyes on the swirling black surface. "You told me Daniel cares about what people think of him, his reputation, his job, the way he looks on the outside. That's your leverage. You don't have to shout. Just hold up a mirror in public and let the crowd do the echoing." "A mirror," I repeated. He nodded. "Something that shows him the distance between who he says he is and who he's been to you. No yelling. No dramatics. You control the scene. He controls the shame." I thought about that for a long minute. "And if he walks away?" "Then he'll walk, carrying the image of himself you gave him." That's a heavy souvenir, my friend. I finished my coffee and felt a strange clarity settle over me. Revenge, I realized, didn't have to look like rage. It could look like truth, shown at the right angle, under the right light. By afternoon, the plan had begun to take shape. Joe and I sat at my kitchen table, pages of old photographs spread out like evidence. Birthdays, baseball games, graduation, Daniel holding Lily as a baby. Proof that once he'd been present. Proof that forgetting wasn't destiny. It was a choice. We'll need a setting, Joe said. Somewhere he won't expect you to have an audience. The community hall, I answered. They're hosting a charity night next month. Daniel's firm is sponsoring part of it. He'll be there. Joe raised an eyebrow. Perfect. Public without being hostile. We spent hours piecing it together. A short slideshow, a few recorded messages, a gentle introduction that would sound like nostalgia but unfold into confrontation. A family story disguised as a presentation about legacy and memory. At the end, I'd reveal one line, Lily's text, projected in bold letters across the screen. Joe's voice was calm, methodical. That's your mirror. Everyone will see it. No yelling necessary. But I wanted more. The wound in me was personal, and the lie had been public, even if whispered. What about the will? I asked. Joe looked up. What about it? I could announce a change that night. Something symbolic. Make it clear that truth matters more than blood convenience. He studied me for a long moment. If you do, don't make it punishment. Make it consequence. There's a difference. I'll think about that, I said, though we both knew I already had. When he left, the sun was sliding down behind the trees, painting the house in amber light. I sat alone with the photographs and the plan, feeling the peculiar calm that comes when a storm finally chooses its direction. I imagined Daniel's face when he saw the images, heard the story, realized the lie he'd told had reached the one person he thought wouldn't fight back. I didn't want him destroyed. I wanted him haunted by recognition. That night, I wrote him a message. Simple, polite, impossible to refuse. Daniel, the town's hosting a small event next month. I'm giving a short talk on family legacies. It would mean a lot if you and Lily could come. I read it twice before hitting send. It wasn't an invitation. It was the first step in a reckoning wrapped in good manners. When his reply came a few minutes later, "Of course, Dad. Proud of you for still being active," I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me. He had no idea what he'd just agreed to. I closed the phone and whispered Joe's mantra under my breath, testing how it felt in my mouth. Don't teach him a lesson. Teach him how to come home. But as I said it, I realized the second half of the sentence I wasn't ready to admit. Sometimes, to make someone come home, you have to make them afraid to stay away. I'd rehearsed the lines in the mirror until they lost their edges, until the words felt like something I could wear without trembling. Rehearsal, I learned, is the gentle cousin of resolve. It softens the shock for the one who plans it and steels the nerve for the one who must stand in the light. The community hall smelled like varnish and boiled coffee the night we set up. Folding chairs clicked into rows like a metronome. Volunteers hung a banner for the town's charity night, unaware that we were rewiring the evening for a private reckoning. Joe moved like a man who had seen too many endings to be surprised by beginnings. He carried the projector, the spare extension cord, the little box of relics we would feed to the screen. Lily sat with us in the back, clutching a small envelope her father thought contained nothing more than her drawings. She had agreed, with the weariness of a child who knows grown people keep complicated boxes of truth, to be our witness and, if needed, our softener. Her trust was the part of the plan I could not let break. The audience gathered slowly. Neighbors who liked a cause, a few faces tied to Daniel's firm, old acquaintances who remembered me from the town council, and a scattering of family whose presence felt like warm light. Daniel arrived fashionably late, the way men in his world do, phone in hand, posture practiced for confidence. He greeted people with the easy charm that had built him a reputation. Invisible armor he polished like a badge. He kissed Lily on the head in a quick motion that looked brief and rehearsed, and I felt a small hollow open in my chest. That briefness would be one of the things the night would have to answer for. We sat at a modest table near the front with Joe pretending to fuss with microphones and me pretending to be calm. My heart was a well-oiled instrument of betrayal and longing. Every beat mapped the plan we had spent weeks carving. I had decided on a hybrid. Truth shown in public, and a financial consequence hung like a weight at the end so Daniel could not dismiss the evening as mere spectacle. It wasn't cruelty, it was consequence. In the months prior, I had taken to the careful counting of ledgers, small savings tucked away, some older investments, and a modest house in town that had been my anchor for 50 years. I'd arranged with my lawyer to change the distribution of a portion of that estate to something Daniel could not ignore. Not to punish irreparably, but to attach a visible cost to the lie his brief excuse had inflicted. The document was clear, a conditional gift, held in trust for 10 years, for the son who acknowledges his absence openly and repairs it in word and deed. It read like legal poetry, and I intended, that night, to make its existence a public fact. A face-to-face confession would be the gate, the trust would be the lever. People would watch what being responsible looked like. That was the point, to make accountability show in light and ledger, both. When the lights dimmed and the projector flickered to life, the hall softened into attentive darkness. I began, quietly, the way Joe had coached me, not accusing, but telling. I told an ordinary story, birthdays, baseball, the way a small boy once crawled into my lap and asked if I could fix everything with my hands. I let warmth into my voice because truth needs the gentleness of memory when it walks out into a room full of strangers. The slideshow rolled, black and white photos of Daniel as a boy, balloons stuck to rafters, messy cake frosting on his chin. The images were ordinary and deadly because they revealed what had once been. I let silent time stretch between slides so the room could lean in and fill the spaces with their own imaginations. I played voicemail clips we'd salvaged over the years, Daniel's young voice promising attendance, laughter, presence. The effect was cumulative. A soft erosion of the confident man in the front row. Then, carefully, we brought the present into the frame. Lily's message appeared in the center of the screen in simple black text. Grandpa, is it true you wanted to be alone yesterday? The font looked cruel and childish and utterly final. A hush rolled through the hall like a tide withdraw. I watched Daniel's face in the dim light. He had the look people get when they realize a photograph held in their hands is of someone else, a stranger whose history just replaced their narrative. He shifted on the chair, composure fraying at the edges. I said nothing for a moment longer than felt polite. The silence itself was an instrument. People hate being left to their own conclusions, and that's what I wanted them to do, to come to a slow verdict alongside me. Once we'd allowed the room to hold the question, I spoke the next line that would pivot the evening from revelation to reckoning. I told them about the trust and the conditional clause. The words were simple, legal, and sharp as glass. I explained, without theatrical flourish, that a portion of my estate would be placed in a trust, accessible only to the son who publicly acknowledged his absence and took steps to repair it before the trustee. This isn't punishment, I said, watching every face. It's a consequence visible to the people he cares about. If your absence is to be excused, let it be excused by courage rather than convenience. There was a murmur, half sympathy, half scandal. Daniel stood, his face an ugly ledger of shame and anger. His hand hit his pocket where his phone sat like an accusation. He was about to leave the row. The man who fled before hard things had always fled, but Lily moved then in a way that snagged the air. She stood, tiny and unafraid, and handed him the small envelope. He opened it with hands that betrayed him, and his face went pale again as a recording. One we'd asked her to make months earlier when she'd sensed the widening, played for the hall. It was Daniel's voice as a promise, as a father, vowing to be there. His own words had been recorded and preserved to show the man he once was. The room hung on that recording like a witness to a crime of neglect. Daniel's jaw worked as if he considered apologies as muscles to be exercised in private. He started toward the door, shoulders squared for exit, but the crowd, colleagues, neighbors, and a few people whose quiet respect for me had been honed in town meetings and coffee lines, turned their attention toward him. Shame is a public currency. You can spend it or invest it. At the doorway he paused, and for the first time that night, I saw him in the nakedness of a man out of practice with his own mistakes. He looked at me, really looked, the way children stare at adults when they finally learn they're fallible. Then he said something I had not planned for. "Dad, please," his voice broke. It was not a perfect apology. It was more a plea for a way back. We had placed the door on the stage and had given him the handle. Now the question was whether he would turn it to step through. When Daniel spoke my name across that crowded hall, the sound of it didn't carry anger or defiance. It carried exhaustion, the surrendering voice of a man whose defenses had run out of room to hide. He stood by the door, light from the corridor outlining him in gold, making him look smaller than I remembered. People's eyes moved between us like spectators at a play unsure when to clap. I didn't speak at first. I let the silence do what words couldn't, strip everything unnecessary away. Finally, I said, "You lied to my granddaughter." The words were plain, no performance left in them. "You told her I wanted to be alone." "That wasn't your truth, Daniel. That was your cover." He nodded, barely. "I know, Dad. I raised a hand, stopping him. "You just couldn't face telling her you forgot." The murmur in the crowd faded to nothing. There's a kind of silence that feels like mercy preparing to appear, and that's what the hall felt like. A moment suspended between punishment and possibility. Daniel's eyes filled, but not the theatrical kind of tears. These were the tired ones, the kind that mean a man's pride has finally collapsed under the weight of its own logic. He walked toward me slowly, his shoes loud against the wooden floor. When he reached the front, he took the microphone from my shaking hand. "I did forget," he said, voice breaking in halves. "There was no emergency. I just didn't want to feel guilty again for not being enough. I've been saying I'm busy my whole life, but what I really am is scared of not being the son you thought you raised." The honesty landed heavy. In that moment, he looked nothing like the confident man from earlier, just a son trying to hand his father the truth, even if it cut. I looked at him and felt the plan, my beautifully constructed, precise revenge, twist in my chest like a blade turned backward. Joe's words returned to me. "Don't teach them a lesson. Teach them how to come home." The crowd was silent still. Even the hum of the projector seemed to fade. I took a breath and said, "Then come home, Daniel. That's all I ever wanted." He nodded, one quick motion, as if afraid that if he lingered too long in the gesture, it might dissolve. I turned to the audience, the witnesses to our private war, and said, "That's the clause. You've all heard it. The will stands as it is, the trust remains. Not to punish, but to remind. Because love without consequence turns to noise, and noise fades." Then I stepped back, leaving him in the light. The applause that followed wasn't for me. It was for the bravery of seeing a man publicly own his shame. After the event, the hall emptied quickly, leaving behind the smell of coffee, dust, and resolution. Daniel approached me slowly, shoulders slumped, eyes searching my face for something more than permission. He started to speak, but I stopped him again, this time gently. "No more apologies," I said. "Just start showing up. For me. For her." He nodded. "I will." And then, in a quiet voice, "Did you mean it about the will?" "Yes." He blinked, uncertain. "So it's conditional?" I smiled, tired. "Everything worth keeping is." We stood there in silence until Lily came running back in, her small hand finding his, then mine, connecting us like a bridge we'd almost let collapse. For the first time in years, I felt something uncoil in my chest. Not joy exactly, but the faint relief of pain that has finally done its job. That night, after they drove away, I sat with Joe outside the hall as the janitor locked up. He lit a cigarette he wasn't supposed to have, coughed once, and said, "You did it. Not bad for a man who never complained." I chuckled softly. It didn't feel like victory. "It's not," he said. "It's repair. It hurts different." I looked up at the stars and thought of my wife, how she'd always said men mistake silence for strength. Maybe she was right. Maybe I'd spent my whole life mistaking endurance for love. A week later, Joe was gone. Heart they said. The chair he always took at the diner stayed empty for a while, until the owner put a small brass plaque there that read "Reserved for old friends." When Daniel and Lily came by on Sundays after that, we always kept an extra plate at the table. For Joe, for memory, for the price of our peace. Daniel started helping around the house. Sometimes he'd call just to talk, nothing urgent, no apologies hidden in the pauses. Lily painted a picture of the three of us together and pinned it to the fridge. One evening, as we cleared the dishes, Daniel looked at me and said, "You could have just yelled at me, you know." I smiled faintly. "You wouldn't have heard me." He nodded, accepting the truth without argument. When they left that night, I stood by the door, the quiet humming around me again, not empty now, just softer. The man who never complained had finally learned that love, if left silent too long, will invent its own language of consequence. I sat down, looked at the empty chair across from me, and whispered, "You did good, old man. You did good." And for once, I believed it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us.